All right. Hello. Okay, so this afternoon, we are talking about The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Do let me know. Have you read this before? What did you think of this story as we sort of wait for folks to trickle in? I would love to know how you felt about this reading experience. So this was a new read for myself, and it's strange. I'm not really sure how I feel about it. I've read it twice, and I feel like it prompted me to sort of self-reflect more than it prompted like any sort of desire to analyze or pull apart the text the way I typically would with a piece of like a book club fiction. So, not that I didn't enjoy it, but that I think it pushed me personally a little bit. So I would love to know, how did you experience this weird little text? Hey, Lydia, how are you? So yeah, I enjoyed the Hempstocks a lot. I feel like a lot of the other characters were just so peripheral. Like everybody is loosely fleshed out. Normally I ask about like favorite characters, favorite moments, and I would love to hear if anyone has a favorite character or favorite moment. The moment that stands out to me is not a happy moment. It's not a favorite moment, but it's one that sits with me still. And that's the opening where our narrator tells us about his 7th birthday party that no one shows up to. And the thing that stands out specifically is that he gets to play the pass the parcel game by himself. And he's sad because no one's there to play the game with him, but he's happy because he got a Batman. And like, that just, it hurt my heart. It really hurt my heart. And I mean, I think overall, I don't know how folks feel. It's not I didn't find it an uplifting story. So there are definitely moments and quotes that stand out, but not in a good way. So I guess if you want to contribute at all to the chat, let me know your thoughts on the story, what you thought about it. While you have a moment to chat or to offer your thoughts there, I just want to quickly go through sort of the format for tonight. So generally, we're going to work from beginning to end and sort of increase in spoilers with each sort of segment. I've divided the book into 3 or 4 chunks. And so the very ending of the book, the reveal, will very much not be up for discussion until the very ending. Everything else, I've sort of structured this so that it's light spoilers. So I'm hoping that folks have actually had an opportunity to read the book, because it is interesting. It's strange. So quick plot synopsis for us, because I found like I forgot a lot of things from the initial read to the reread. It's a story that takes place in a flashback, and we have a man returning to his hometown for a funeral, and he goes to this friend's house that he hasn't been to in ages, and he just ends up lost in memory, sitting by their pond. And it's that memory that's really the story that I think is the interesting part that we're going to talk about for the most part. I think overall, we're asked to think a lot about the nature of memories, and that memory is kind of what makes us who we are, and they're not perfect. I think what we get from this text is that memories are very much not perfect. They can be affected by many factors, natural or supernatural in this case, and they can be corrupted, and that they're not, I guess they're not objective, right, is the thing that I feel like I really took away from this. And so I'm curious if anyone found themselves stopping to think about childhood and how they remembered things. I feel like the boy is really, or the adult narrator is reframing his memories of boyhood as he's sort of sitting by this duck pond, right? Ooh, good. So Lydia has mentioned that you highlighted a lot of quotes about adults versus children, and I do want to talk about that. Actually, I have a section for adults and children, because yeah, I see that as like a really strong theme throughout this text. And I think, again, going back to how we remember things as children versus adults, I recently had the opportunity to reflect on something that happened in high school, and I went and found it in journals, and I have like emails and text messages printed out, and I came to discover that how I remembered it as an adult, how I talked about it as friends who experienced the same thing, was very different from how I recorded it when I was 16, and how it's like the primary source of emails and texts are very different from how it has come to be remembered. And I think part of that is like the narrative making, like as we remember something over and over again with more and more of our life baggage, right? We sort of shape what our experiences, right? So I think it's interesting to see, I guess, how often the boy or the adult narrator tells us something that he remembers as a boy that now has different meaning to him. I'm thinking specifically the one that stands out is the moment where the boy witnesses his father touch Ursula Monkton's bum. And at the time, this means nothing to him. And he actually says something like, I was 7. I didn't know what this meant. But as an adult remembering it, he's like, oh no, this is a very different thing. This contact between my father and the babysitter has consequences. It's not just a like innocent thing. So yeah, I think the discussions around memory and childhood are very interesting. Okay, so I like the first chunk that I see of this book are sort of the like the first domino that gets pushed, right? We have so this is slight spoilers for the beginning of the book. The opal miner's death that awakens an entity that begins to meddle in humans' lives. And the narrator has met these hempstock women, his neighbors, and when he chokes up a coin, he decides to go to them for help because they seem a little bit unusual, a little bit magical, a little bit, I guess, special, right? And Letty Hempstock, the youngest, brings him on an adventure into another world to bind this entity and hopefully save them from meddling. And instead, the boy becomes a gateway into the real world, our world. And I think it's interesting that in that first little bit, like a lot happens to set this up, and a lot goes wrong. And I think some of the characters that I want to talk about sort of, I guess it fits their archetype, it fits how they're constructed as characters, that things go the way they do. But before we get to the Hempstocks, I kind of want to talk about the boy protagonist and gender, the ways that gender is represented here. So our boy protagonist, and this is one of those things that I would love to know your thoughts on this, he's unnamed. As an adult, he doesn't have a name. As a child, he doesn't have a name. And I'm curious how that unnamed character impacted your relationship to him. Did you feel more connected to the story, more connected to him, or less connected? Was it something that allowed you to distance from him? Because I feel like that could go both ways, right? On the one hand, I could see him being unnamed might allow us to really picture ourselves in that situation, to imagine ourselves in his place as sort of this child experiencing something otherworldly. But I guess on the other hand, there aren't unnamed protagonists that I have ever felt close to. Like, I feel like characters with very specific names, characters whose names are super important, like Anne Shirley, that Anne with an E, right? She comes to be our friend, and we, as readers, sort of grow attached to her, and we can think of her as something else. Like, we could write fan fiction, like with Harry Potter. Those characters, they're named, and their names are important to how we relate to the story, right? And so I feel like by leaving him unnamed, I could never be close to this character. Like, no matter how many times I reread this book, the boy is never going to be that, like, character that lives rent-free in my head, right? The way that Anne Shirley, Alana the Lioness, Harry Potter, whatever, like, those characters almost feel real. And I think in part it's because they have a name, and that name has power, and it marks them as something separate. Did you guys, or did you folks feel that the unnamed aspect was important? I'm just curious how folks felt about that. Well, I'll let you noodle on that. I think it's also important to talk about how our boy protagonist is not like other boys. We have so many women who are not like other girls in young adult literature, in children's literature, fantasy literature. And he's very much set up as not like other boys, right? I'm thinking specifically right off the bat, we are told that the cake had a book drawn on it in icing, and the lady at the bakery said that they had never put a book on a birthday cake before, and that mostly for boys it was footballs or spaceships. I was their first book, end quote. And that's on page 9. The idea that not only is he not like other boys who have footballs and spaceships, he's not like any of the children. They have never put a book on a cake before. And then, obviously, that no one comes to his birthday party. It's just devastating. I like, he must be so odd that no parent would take this birthday party as an opportunity for, like, free babysitting and food, right? Like, any parent that I have ever met has been stressed and has so many things to do. To have somebody offer to entertain and, like, feed your child for a couple of hours, that just seems like too big an opportunity to pass up. So that not one kid had, like, expressed enough of, well, I guess the parents actually, right? That they were like, oh no, I believe you. This kid is weird enough that you're not going to this party. I don't want to send you there. I just, it very much marks our protagonist as, like, very outside. And then we also learn that he is a reader, and eventually that he becomes an artist as an adult. So we learn that his birthday present that he's really excited about is a Narnia box set. And he, quote, lay on his bed and lost himself in the stories. I liked that. Books were safer than other people anyway, end quote, on page 9. So that again and again, we're sort of told that he's not like other boys. And I mean, I guess in some ways, this maybe makes him more endearing to us as readers. Like, if you're participating in the act of reading this book, you are probably more like the unnamed boy than perhaps his classmates with footballs on their cakes. So, I mean, again, it just goes on, like, establishing in the first few pages that our protagonist is an outsider, right? He gets a kitten instead of a puppy. The gendering of pets, of what we usually associate with genders of children. Puppies are for boys, kitties are for girls, right? Like, it's bullshit, but I mean, our outsider protagonist doesn't get the puppy. He doesn't get like the rough and tumble dog to... I can think of so many children's books where they have a dog sidekick, right? And often terrible things happen to the dog, and that's part of like the child's arc. But here we have a kitten that has a terrible thing happen to it. So again, sort of playing with the established rules for appropriate gifts, appropriate sidekicks for boys. And I don't know, I find it... Part of me feels like we're very much supposed to feel that the boy is not like other boys, that he is subversive in some ways. But then I also, like, outside of the gendered implications there, like the gender stereotypes, I feel like it's maybe the more universal experience as well of being like the shy kid, the reader, the introvert. And I don't know, I feel like I see myself a lot in the child. Like, reading is an activity that adults approve of, right? Like, we really want our kids to have opportunities. We want them to be able to read. And so it's like a safe activity. Like, I'm going to perhaps date myself, but like the idea of Rory Gilmore, she is told off at the private school for not getting involved enough and not making friends because she just sits at her lunch table and reads a book. And she finds that ridiculous, right? Like, and it is kind of ridiculous that anyone would critique a kid for reading. So yeah, I feel like it's interesting, both in the boy being sort of a subversive figure, but also that making him feel more real and relatable to myself. Like, I was definitely that kid that brought a book to large family gatherings, and like I would hide with the book because, like, who's going to tell me off for reading for school or not for school, right? And it allowed me to sort of escape those overwhelming situations. I'm just going to turn to the chat here. Kettle Cat didn't realize. Yeah, so I actually don't know. So, sorry, I will finish the thought. Kettle Cat didn't realize that he doesn't have a name until I mentioned it. Yeah, that I feel like as well, that the first person narrative sort of conceals that. So in some ways, I wonder if between the first person and the lack of a name, if it's supposed to invite more folks in to like really see from his perspective, to I guess feel closer to him, because we don't have that clear separate identity of like a named character. Lydia mentions that him being unnamed didn't make me feel unconnected to him. There was such a sad human aspect, like no one showed up to his birthday party. It's true. He is very he is very relatable, I feel like. And he almost feels very young for 7. Like the little detail of him wanting to have the door open a crack to have light from the hall shine in. Like he's very much established as this very sensitive, very human child. I did appreciate that about him. Lyra mentions, oh, it's okay that you're not that you're not done with the book yet. They liked his relation with books and how there was a story we were given during different incidents. Yes, like the miss part. I also feel like the ways that storytelling comes up, he really mirrors what he sees in the stories. So like when he wants to escape the house, he's like, well, I've seen children in books shimmy down drain pipes, so I shimmy down a drain pipe. I liked how much stories sort of shaped his world, shaped how he behaved. And yes, that line about adults following a path and children explore. I do want to talk about this later. I actually have it pulled to talk about adults versus kids. And I also I do think it's not as literal as the boys taking it. Okay, so if we're talking about boys, we should also talk about the men in this book. There are 2 men with significant roles. The opal miner, who is a terrible person. He gambled away his investors' money, and he, instead of taking responsibility for these actions, either like going to jail or working to pay them back, he decides to end his life. On top of that, he murders a kitten, and he believes that living creatures are interchangeable. So he runs over the boy's pet, and instead of like acknowledging the significance of this, just grabs any cat that he can find, puts it in a box, and gives the boy just a replacement cat, but you can't replace living things. So that's not great. And then I think the father is the more significant male character, man, in this book. So I really see him as a very strict patriarch. He expects obedience. And even before Ursula Monckton's involvement, there's this line about how he prides himself on never beating his children because he was beat as a child. And to me, that almost feels more threatening. Like, he will shout, and he will shout about how he's never going to hit you. But I feel like that's not in most children's heads before you tell them that that's an option. Do you know what I mean? Like, because kids are sort of like blank slates, they're learning as they go. If it's not a part of like how you are disciplining a child, why even bring up that like I could hit you? It could get worse. So like I find him very uncomfortable to read. And then the fact that Ursula Nordstrom just gives him a little nudge, and he almost drowns his child in a bathtub for refusing to eat a dinner prepared by a stranger. I mean, several things I hate about this. He doesn't respect like his child's autonomy over what he wants to put in his body, which I feel like is kind of gross. There are so many reasons for somebody not wanting to eat, and that the father's like, no, you must eat this. You must eat it. And then as punishment for that, it's this huge overreaction. And okay, I guess kids are allowed to be rude, and they should have consequences for being rude. But in like working with children, and if any folks have children or work with children, they're strange little creatures, right? Like they get stressed out, and like routines getting broken is a big thing, right? So like recently, in the past little bit, the boy's mom has left to start a new job. She's no longer the stay-at-home mom, and there's a stranger in their house, like set aside that she's like evil and not of this world, and do you know what I mean? Like, set that aside. Just take the supernatural out. It would be very understandable for this kid who's had so much upset to be like, no, I will assert some control and I will not put this food in my body. So I just find the father really gross. And I don't know how folks feel about this. I think we're led to believe that Ursula Monkton has manipulated the father in some way, that she's sort of playing with him like a toy, like that these are her pets and she's directing them and guiding them to behave in certain ways. But I find it hard to believe that these capabilities, these actions, desires weren't already in the father in the first place. Like, he cheats on his wife, he has sex with the babysitter, and he almost drowns his child. That possibility for violence was already in him. And that he was already sort of a scary father. Lydia, you agree? Yeah, like even before Ursula Monkton starts sort of changing things, like the father very early on starts coming home from work early to hang out with Ursula, like without even spending too much time. That, I guess, capacity for such a betrayal of his family is just so close, you know? I don't know. It's worth noting that the men in this book are not great. And they really stand, I think, in contrast to the boy then, right? The boy, he definitely doesn't have a lot in common with his father. And I think it's at some point later in adulthood, he becomes close to his father once they have something in common to like bond over. But at this point in his life, the boy is like not at all close to his father. And I think that's kind of interesting. I like it. I can also see why you wouldn't want to be super close with your dad if he's like always on the edge and threatening you with not hitting you. In contrast, I think it's really cool that the women with significant roles in this book are powerful. I say that because the mother is just sort of this whisper of a character. But Letty, Ginny Hemstock, and old Mrs. Hemstock are all very powerful. And I mean, even Ursula Monkton, our antagonist, is powerful and otherworldly. They liken her to a parasite. But she has this power to manipulate humans, to wield lightning, and to assert control over the world around her. And I think it's interesting that I didn't read her as evil for evil's sake, because she's a parasite and she has to use others to survive, right? Like she has this motivation. She wants to do things in the boys' world, and it sort of violates the rules of the world. but she does it because she wants to survive. It's not, again, it's not like evil for evil's sake, which I appreciate. And then Letty, Ginny, and old Mrs. Hemstock are incredibly interesting women, incredibly powerful women. They have such control over their lives and their land. They are self-sustaining, right? They work and live off the land and what they produce on it. They are fiercely protective, and they have powerful magic. They can manipulate memory. They can manipulate, it seems like, time. Old Mrs. Hemstock is able to have like the full moon out one window, and the rest of the windows you can see other moon phases, but like that one window she's able to control it, right? And I think like we're told that Letty doesn't have a father. Men were not involved in her creation, apparently. And there are no Hemstock men on the farm. There are Hemstock men, but they just sort of wander away and never come back. They're not involved in the lives of these women. And so it's a little bit cheating here to pull in other books, but the Hemstock name shows up in other Gaiman works. So there's Liza Hemstock in the Graveyard book. She is a witch buried in the graveyard that Bod goes looking for at some point. Daisy Hemstock, I believe, is from Stardust. I haven't read that book, but once I realized that Hemstock had showed up in a couple of places, I wondered where else they showed up. And so Daisy Hemstock in Stardust. And then the internet also revealed that in the Sandman comics, there are 3 women, the Furies, and they align with, they're almost like parallel universes or a reiteration of the Letty, Ginny, and old Mrs. Hemstock characters. And I think through this like, the women in 3 phases of their lives, I think it would be hard to miss the connection to the triple goddess in neo-pagan beliefs and the fates of Greek myth. So I want to talk a little bit about both. So the triple goddess, it's part of, okay, so here's where it gets a little bit controversial. And so I don't want to talk about them as religious beliefs, as a religion that is currently practiced by people, but more as like symbols. So each one is sort of a distinct phase in a woman's life cycle, and it aligns with the phase of the moon, right? So we have the maiden, mother, and crone, and I sort of read them as a response to the Judeo-Christian God. The God is 3 in 1, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, right? You have this, again, debates around it's hard to talk about folks' religion, but the, I guess, neo-pagan movement that we see sort of happened in the 70s alongside the feminist movement. So I really see these 3 archetypes functioning as a feminist response to more patriarchal triple god. And so I think it's interesting that we have that here, right? We have Letty, the maiden. The maiden is new beginnings, youth, the waxing moon, right? The this is going to be backwards, but like, how do I want to, trust me, the little sliver of the moon, right? The waxing moon. Then we have Mrs. Hemstock, Ginny Hemstock, the mother. That's the full moon. That's ripeness, fertility, sexuality, power, and life. And then we have the waning moon. Again, we're back to the little sliver. And that's the old Mrs. Hemstock, the crone, and wisdom and death and endings. And it's interesting that neo-pagan idea, again, sort of dialogues with the fates from myth, again, because the boy loves myths, right? Our narrator tells us that myths are great because they're not for children or adults. They just are. And the idea of this interest in myth already from the boy. So the fates are, yes, the toenail moon. Oh, it's a cute way of describing it. So the fates are these goddesses who they are the spinner of life, the allotter of life, and the inflexible one, so the one who ends life. It shears off that thread of life. And I think that myth imagery of the fate that represents the past, the fate that aligns with death and endings, is also in line with the crone. And we have Mrs. Hemstock, old Mrs. Hemstock, with her shears snipping memories, right? Like she literally ends thoughts. She ends the father's anger when he shows up at their house and they snip out the whole afternoon where he almost drowned his son to when he and the mother show up united front to take him home. Mrs. Hempstock has those, or old Mrs. Hempstock, sorry, has those shears to cut that out, right? So I think it's cool to see how these are at work in the text. And I feel like some of the faults of the characters are because of the archetypes that they're aligned with. Like, if we think about Letty the maiden, right? She's the youngest of the women, the least experienced, and it's her inexperience that really causes problems. It's again, one of those first dominoes that goes. So she decides to try and bind Ursula, the entity known as Ursula, without knowing its true name. And Ursula tells her, quote, "Your mother wouldn't have been so foolish. I'm not scared of you, little girl," end quote, on page 114. So the creature itself acknowledges that Letty is making these youthful mistakes as the maiden, right? And then the boy recognizes the song that she sings. So she's doing magic and she's speaking in an old language, but the tune is from a children's nursery rhyme. So the magic that she uses is children's magic, right? And then a little bit of spoilers later, but the Letty at some point reveals that the ocean, if you're immersed in it, you have all of the knowledge of the universe. And the boy's like, "You gave all this up?" And she's like, "Of course I gave all this up. You have to give it up if you want to play in the world." And I want to emphasize play, that only a child, I feel like, would give up everything to play, right? So a lot of the things that go wrong that Letty is involved in is because she is this maiden figure, this maiden archetype. And then if we think about Mrs. Hempstock, our mother, the present, the full moon, when we first meet her, the narrator tells us, quote, "She seemed like she was someone's mother," end quote, on page 21, which I'm not going to lie, kind of bothers me. Like, I can fully respect that parent is a role that people choose. But it bothers me that, like, capital M mother is expected or prescribed. And that, I feel like, is one of the critiques of this triple goddess, that each represents a sort of prescribed stage in a woman's life. that a maiden, and it's always in context to men. So like the maiden is a maiden because she hasn't had sex yet. She hasn't been deflowered. She is not sexual like the mother, right? And then the crone on the other end has lost the value of being a reproducer. So I think I have to do more research on maybe more contemporary takes on these archetypes, and if folks have maybe retooled these figures to acknowledge that women can do more with their life than fit these three phases, that takes less of the value away from biology, and that will acknowledge more genders, because right now this still very much fits into the gender binary. So as much as I think it's cool that Gaiman has these really powerful women, I don't love that one of those women is just mother. Like that's all we know about her is mother. What we see her do is mother. She makes food, she keeps the house, and it's like a very traditional idea of what a mother is too. To sort of distance from the mother aspect, if we want to focus more on the fates, that Mrs. Hempstock represents the present, which I like better. I like it that she tends to physical needs, right? In practical concerns, which is a very much present way to live and be. When the narrator hugs Ginny for comfort, he tells us that, quote, she smelled like a farm and like a kitchen, like animals, like food. She smelled very real. And the realness was what I needed at that moment, end quote. And that's on page 154. So I feel like she's one of the only characters that gets linked to the physical senses, right? Like we don't know a lot about the other women. Mrs. Hempstock has like old Mrs. Hempstock story. Tongue-tied. Old Mrs. Hempstock has like cobwebby hair and is thin and frail. And Letty Hempstock wears white at one point, and I think like a red skirt and a red coat. But we don't get a lot about how they smell or feel. Whereas Mrs. Hempstock, who is our present, she has that tactileness to her, which I think is interesting. And then, of course, we have old Mrs. Hempstock, the crone, the past, and the narrator actually describes her as, quote, the essence of grandmotherliness, end quote, which I love. She's like sitting in a rocking chair at that moment, just keeping him company by the fire, and the essence of grandmotherliness. She's like grandma condensed. And again, we don't know that much about her. I feel like the character that we know the most about is Letty. We spend the most time with Letty, and we see that childlike character to her. And I think it almost speaks to the way that older women sort of lose value, that we are not as interested in women that are not sexually desirable anymore. All that, like if you think about who is in the tabloids, who is hot, we're not really looking at Meryl Streep's, we're not looking at Judi Dench's, we're not looking at Diane Keaton's. we're looking at Angelina Jolie's, we're looking at Megan Fox's, right? So it almost speaks to how we treat the crone as a society, that we really don't know anything about her other than grandmother, grandmother condensed. True. So Lydia has mentioned in the chat that it's interesting to think about Ginny Hempstock as the present, in the sense that she's the one that is there for him when he goes back. Yes. Yeah. That she's always there. I love that. I love that. So I'm curious if folks feel that having these goddess-like women, these otherworldly women represented in the Hempstocks, sort of changes how you feel about the story and their role in the story. Is it just sort of fitting in with Neil Gaiman's larger body of works, right? Like he wrote American Gods, where we see the old gods of myth and legend that have slowly withered because humans don't really worship them in modern times. Instead, we worship technology. And we see that rise of new gods in American Gods. Is it just that, like, we're seeing these waxing gods in a pocket, living out their lives unworshipped in the country? Just sort of a neat, this is what they're up to. And this is what happens when they meddle with human lives and they cross over with humans. I genuinely don't have an answer for this. I honestly don't know how I feel about the idea that these might be gods sort of right next door to reality. I don't know. I've been thinking about this for months now, since I've read and reread this book. And I almost wish that they weren't, like, that I could unthink and just have them be like kind of magical women, opposed to women with so much potential literary baggage, if that makes sense. Hopefully. So if any folks have any thoughts on the Hempstocks, I would love to hear that as well. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is food. If we're thinking about Mrs. Hempstock and how she's always cooking, food is one of those things in literature that is shorthand. It allows a writer to tell the readership something about the characters without actually telling them, right? It's one of those show, don't tell. And I think specifically we see this a lot in children's literature. And again, I'm curious about, this is a question that comes up a lot for me, who is the intended audience for this text? Would you give this to a kid? Could a kid read it? Would a kid want to read it? Because it's marketed as adult fantasy. But our protagonist is 7, which would very safely put him in middle grade, right? So keep that in mind. And I'm going to chat a little bit about food and the food that we see here. So as a very basic example that I feel like a lot of us are familiar with, if you think about food in Harry Potter, who is providing the food, right? So one of the scenes in the very first Harry Potter books is when the Dursleys go to the zoo and they buy their son and his friend elaborate ice creams and reluctantly buy Harry a lemon ice lolly, some frozen flavored water, right? Like their child gets rich, creamy, fatty, delicious foods, and the kid that they don't like gets frozen flavored water. And then when we shift to Hogwarts or the Weasleys, we get this abundance of home-cooked food. There is choice, there is comfort food. At Hogwarts, there's always dessert, right? So if we look at who is providing the food in Harry Potter, that tells us a lot about who they are as people. So the Weasleys are good because they nourish Harry, and in the same way that they nourish him with food, they nourish him with love. And the opposite is true with the Dursleys, right? They do not love Harry, so they do not nourish him with food. To go to one of Gaiman's other works, one that is actually children's lit, we have Coraline, and food is a big thing in Coraline as well. So we have three people serving food here. So we have Coraline's parents, who serve home-cooked food, but really like fancy, weird stuff. Like it's never just like a breaded chicken strip with like mashed, like, you know, kids like bland, blank, white foods. If it's beige, it's great. Stick some ketchup on it, it's great. Her parents are cooking like elaborate sauces and moles and like crusting things with nuts, and not kid-friendly food. So they're providing food, but it's not what she wants. It's not what her heart wants, right? And then she cooks herself those bland white foods, like she microwaves frozen foods for herself. Again, she's not providing herself with that nourishment. It's a boxed food. And then the other mother, the sort of evil version of her mother, the predatory version of her mother, is the one who actually provides child-appropriate, appealing foods. And I think in Coraline, we almost see this subversion of what food normally means, right? That the food here, the food that is most child appropriate, is from a dangerous caregiver. The other mother does not want to nourish Coraline and to have her succeed. The other mother wants to consume Coraline. So the good food is a trap. And we can't trust, in Gaiman's other works, that the provider of the best food is trustworthy, is a good caregiver. And in Ocean at the End of the Lane, we see something similar. We have food from the father. The father is the only person who cooks food that we see for the boy narrator. And what we see him cook is this hipster, healthy brown bread that he buys from a bakery. It's probably delicious because I'm an adult. But what the boy wants more than anything is that like white pre-sliced Wonder Bread that tastes like nothing, that has no nutritional value. And he wants it made in a toaster. The father's cooking it on a grill and often burns it. But the boy wants this like convenience food. And that's that healthy food that he doesn't like is the only food that we see his family provide. Then Ursula Monkton makes food that is child appropriate, but feels like a trap to the boy. So he sees his sister eating a peanut butter sandwich, and he wonders, quote, whether the sandwiches were dangerous or not, end quote, on page 54. And he actually opts out of eating this child-safe food, this child-friendly food. He grabs a whole bunch of fruit, and he smuggles that out of the house to eat it. And then Ursula cooks a thick vegetable soup, a roast chicken, new potatoes, and frozen peas. And the boy tells us that he loved all the things on the table, but he does not eat any of it. And then the next day for dinner, she makes meatloaf, and he refuses to touch it. He was determined not to eat anything that she had made or cooked or touched. And I find that really interesting that the food that he's being offered is exactly what he wants. It's, again, kid-friendly vegetables, kid-friendly bland items, right? Like no weird crusts, no weird sauces. But the boy doesn't want it, right? He knows that he can't trust her. And so we have this disconnect between what food usually means and in this case, the good food, the child appropriate food, is not the safe choice. It doesn't connect to the good intentions of the caregiver. And then the people providing the best food are the hemp stalks. Over and over again, we see them take food off the land, food that they have harvested with their own hands and cooked at home. So right off, when we first meet them, he gets milk fresh from the cow, which the boy describes as perfectly happy in my mouth. And then he gets porridge with a lump of homemade blackberry jam and cream poured on it, which he thinks tastes perfect. Later, Letty cooks them pancakes with a squeeze of lemon on it and a blob of plum jam in the center rolled up like a cigar. And eating that food in that kitchen, he feels like the Hempstock house is a friendly place. And then old Mrs. Hempstock feeds the boy a lump of honeycomb from the Hempstock's own beehive and a little cream on it. And then when he comes in from the rain, he's given a mug filled with soup from the black pot on the stove. And there's a pie with a shiny crust, brown and glistening. And then for dinner that night, there is a joint of beef with roast potatoes, golden crisp on the outside and soft white inside. Buttered greens I did not recognize, although I think now that they might have been nettles. Roasted carrots all blackened and sweet. I did not think that I liked cooked carrots, so I nearly did not eat one. But I was brave, and I tried it, and I liked it, and was disappointed in boiled carrots for the rest of my childhood. For their dessert was a pie stuffed with apples and swollen raisins and crushed nuts, all topped with a thick yellow custard, creamier and richer than anything I had ever tasted at school or at home. End quote. That's on page 90. So the Hempstocks have weird food, right? Like, it's not really child-friendly food. Like, if I think about the most child-friendly jam, I'm thinking strawberry jam. If I'm thinking a snack, I'm not thinking of like a whole honeycomb. Do you know what I mean? Like, the food that they give him is weird, but it's stuff that they have that, like, their labor is involved, their love is involved in the culturing, in the cultivating, in the harvesting, and the cooking. And so, I mean, I think if we're going by the rules of children's literature, we should trust them, that because they are providing the food that nourishes the boy emotionally and physically, even though it's kind of weird, it's not the most child-friendly food. The rules of children's literature says that we should believe that they have the best intentions, that they are providing the best for the boy. And I'm curious if folks feel the same, especially if you've gotten to the end of the book and you know how it ends. Do the Hempstocks really have the best intentions? So we're going to move on to the part of the book that I titled Shit Gets Weird. So this is the part of the book where things start to crumble for the boy. His father has been seduced by the babysitter. His father has tried to murder him. Hungerbirds are called to eat Ursula when she refuses to be sent home. The hungerbirds then eat Ursula, but then also want to eat the little part of her gateway that remains in his heart. And we now have a new problem. Ursula Monkton, very quickly, no longer the problem at this point in the book. The problem is that these cleaners of the universe also want to obliterate our narrator. And I feel like at this point we have some untruths that are worth unpacking. So I like the word untruth instead of a lie, because I feel like none of these things are explicit and explicitly malicious, and a lie feels like very deliberate, very intentional, whereas untruths are sort of passive things. And so throughout the story, there are a couple of untruths that the boy learns are in fact not the way he believes they are, right? And I think to sort of frame this, to frame these untruths, we have this line from old Mrs. Hempstock, and she reminds us that, quote, "You'll never get any two people to remember anything the same," end quote, on page 167. And so I wonder how many untruths in our lives exist because of how we remember them, right? Like maybe some of these things that the boy comes to believe have to do with sarcasm or tone that he didn't pick up on as a kid. And so I think the first one, the easiest untruth to point out, is the burnt toast, right? So we have this quote, and it's, "At home, my father ate all the most burnt toast. Yum, he'd say, and charcoal, good for you, and burnt toast, my favorite, and he'd eat it all up. And when I was much older, he confessed to me that he had not ever liked burnt toast, had only eaten it to prevent it from going to waste. And for a fraction of a moment, my entire childhood felt like a lie. It was as if one of the pillars of belief that my world had been built upon had crumbled to dry sand," end quote. And that's from page 18. So it's not a lie explicitly, right? It's just this thing that he has come to believe is true that is in fact not true. Like maybe this has to do with no two people remembering anything the same, right? Maybe the father was saying, "Yum, burnt toast, my favorite," right? And the boy only heard the words and not the tone. Or maybe the father sort of jokingly said it and ate it because they're trying to hide their financial situation from their children, right? Like we know that they had money and then they didn't have money and now they have to let out a room in their house to afford where they live. So this like on the bright side thing that they're trying to hide from their kids results in this belief that dad really loves burnt toast. Like if I were to make dad a piece of toast, I would burn it black, right? And I think that's one of the more innocent untruths, but we also learn a couple of more sinister untruths. So the second one that I pulled out is that locked doors stop people. So this is after the boy has refused to eat Ursula's meatloaf and has been rude to her and locked himself in the bathroom. And he has run for this safety, this sanctuary, because bathrooms have locked doors. Locks keep people out. And the father says, "If you don't open this door, I'm breaking it down." And the boy thinks, could he do that? I didn't know. The door was locked. Locked doors stop people coming in. And that's on page 68. And so this is something that kids observe, right? That locks keep people out, that locks, when you're on the other side, keep you safe. They keep things safe inside. And that truth, it's something that everyone learns at some point. Locks only keep honest people out, that locks only keep people with good intentions out. They're more of a symbol, a part of like a larger social understanding that we sort of respect because we've been socialized to respect that, right? Like locking up a large format store, like locking up a Walmart, really, by the time that somebody comes and actually arrives at the store, turns the alarm off, like the lock is only really stopping the honest person that like pulls on the handle and was like, oh, Walmart's closed. Right? It's so the untruth is that social conventions, social norms can be violated, that the father, by breaking the lock, by breaking the door down, he violates this contract, this social understanding that we place on this flimsy symbol of the lock. It's this idea that we are entitled to privacy, that we are entitled to safety, that we are entitled to a space, right? The father breaks that contract. He violates that contract. And that is a difficult untruth to learn. And because of what the hemp stalks do, which we'll talk about at the end, I want to come back to these untruths when we talk, like, full spoilers at the end. This is a difficult truth to learn, and to learn it more than once must be hard. And then earlier in the chat, I feel like two folks brought up the adult-child comparisons that are happening in this text. And so one of the untruths that we learn here is Letty tells us in on it, lets us in on it. And she says, quote, "I'm going to tell you something important. Grown-ups don't look like grown-ups on the inside either. Outside, they're big and thoughtless, and they always know what they're doing. Inside, they look just like they always have, like they did when they were your age. The truth is, there aren't any grown-ups. Not one in the whole wide world." End quote, on page 108. And I feel like that is the most difficult, the most difficult truth and or untruth, that adults know what they're doing. And I feel like it's because we have to fake it. Like, we perpetuate this falsehood that we know what we're doing. And I feel like this hit me hard. This hit me personally. I feel like I keep waiting to feel like a real adult. I have a video coming out next week where I build these shelves behind me, and I keep talking about how I feel like I need a real adult because I'm doing something that I've never done before. And there's this like really like inexperienced childlike fear of making a big mistake and wanting to lean on somebody who feels more adult than I do. And I'm curious if anyone ever feels like a real adult. Like, there have definitely been moments where like I think the most adult I have ever felt is in getting a pet and in having to take responsibility for it. But there are still moments where I'm like, oh no, I need a real adult. I who's the adult in the room? Oh, it's me? Okay. And I'm curious if at any point in life we will ever feel like real adults. So this book, it's a very simple story, but it definitely hit hard. And I'm curious if there are any untruths that you believed as a child that just hit you at some point, like, oh, this isn't true. And the one for myself, it's that for the longest time I was told, don't leave the property or the wolves will get you. And I feel like in part this was an untruth that was told because they didn't want, like, my caregivers didn't want me to wander outside of their line of sight, because there were like woods on the back of their property. And so they used the power of like wolves and fairy tales to be like, hey, it's dangerous. And like how they wanted to obscure that the real predator out of their line of sight is just other fucked up adults. That what they were afraid of is other humans, that other humans can be super hurtful and dangerous, but it's a difficult truth to tell a child. And so to keep the child innocent and safe, I was told the fairy tale wolves are out there. Don't leave the property because the wolves will get you, right? And I'm curious if should we tell kids untruths like this? Is it really worth protecting that, like the burnt toast story, right? Is it worth it to be like, oh, I love burnt toast, instead of, oh, I can't afford to throw this away? Like, would it have been so difficult to admit, like, oh, we're in a kind of precarious financial situation. I literally can't afford to throw this toast away. I don't know how I feel about untruths. So I'm just going to check in with the chat here. Lydia says that they have never felt like a real adult, but also understands now why their parents always were so tired as an adult. Yes, I feel like I have so much sympathy for like the decision fatigue, like when you have no one to tell you what to do and how to do it, that you just have to make a decision because something has to get done. Like so much appreciation for what my parents did, right? Okay, so sort of in line with this idea of truths and untruths and what we tell children, I feel like this text has a very strong stance on the ways in which children excel at life. So we're told that, quote, adults follow paths, children explore. Adults are content to walk the same way hundreds of times or thousands. Perhaps it never occurs to adults to step off paths, to creep beneath rhododendrons, to find spaces between fences. I was a child, which meant I knew a dozen ways of getting out of our property and into the lane, ways that would not involve walking down the drive, end quote. And that's on page 55. And I think it's interesting that this text values the child approach, right? It values deviating from the marked trail, the socially acceptable, the socially provided way to travel, to move in the world. I think so many children's stories, I mean, to go back to the wolf thing, Little Red Riding Hood is about staying on the path, right? Don't get off the marked trail. Don't get distracted from your job. You're responsible for doing this job of taking goods to your sick grandmother. This is your responsibility. And if you don't do this, there are consequences, right? Like the prescription there is stick to the path that we have laid out for you. And I feel like so often we as a society, we have these paths that we're socially conditioned to walk down. And it's folks who leave the path, who sort of rock the boat, that make change. They, right? Like it's, if you want to create a change in your society, if you want to do activism, if you want to push the envelope, break into any sort of space, you have to leave that path for that society's provided for you, right? And I feel like what we have here is this critique of folks who have lost the ability to see that the path that we are on isn't the one that we have to follow, right? That you don't have one way to get to a destination. I don't know. Do you feel like we're maybe being invited to be more childlike? That the whole text, it's a adult remembering this adventure from childhood, that excitement, the unknown, the danger, and like, I mean, again, as a kid, you don't really have the idea of consequences, right? Like, as a kid, I climbed anything. I had no fear of heights, no fear of falling. And now I'm like a shaking mess to get on a roller coaster because the height, the potential of death, even though that's probably so much safer than climbing a tree or climbing a cliff, right? Like, as an adult, I have consequences, and I understand consequences for actions. So the idea of being more childlike feels high stakes. But I guess, again, with the story, there's value in taking more risks, maybe. And then I also wondered if you feel like the narrator as an adult is somebody who stays on the path, or if they have something childlike still about them. We learn that they're an artist. We also know that they deviated from a funeral to stare at a duck pond for a little bit, right? Like the socially responsible thing, the social rules of funerals is that if it's your loved one that dies, especially, you are expected to be there, right? Like you're kind of expected to be there at the gathering after the funeral. You're expected to shake hands. You're expected to remember the life of the person that you've lost and like host other people. And the narrator's just like, fuck that. I'm going to go, I have this impulse to drive. I'm going to go driving. So I wonder if in some ways he has maintained that childlike quality. I feel like also at the beginning he talks a little bit about how he's wearing a black suit and a white shirt, a black tie and black shoes, all polished and shiny, clothes that would normally make him feel uncomfortable, as if I were in a stolen uniform or pretending to be an adult. So that maybe he's maintained something joyful and childlike about him. I don't know. It makes me feel a little bit better about the ending, which we are going to talk about full spoilers right now. So if folks, I feel like everything that we've talked about up to this point would just be fun things to have in your head while you're reading this book, that might be like food for thought as you're reading. But at this point, we are going to spoil the ending. I'm going to take a drink, give folks an opportunity to leave if they don't want the ending spoiled. Alrighty. So the ending. I was not expecting it to go here. at the shit gets weird section, I mentioned that the Hungerbirds wanted to eat the boy's heart. And at the ending of this book, the Hungerbirds start eating the world. They eat things out of existence. And he decides to sacrifice himself. He doesn't want his world to disappear. And there's this moment where it's like a both and, like both things are true, and because they're both true, I guess neither can be true. The boy dies and also doesn't die. He has this memory. There's like an italicized, bracketed moment where, and I did not keep the page, but like formatted in the text, there's this like break where both things end up being true, right? So the birds do eat his heart. He does die, and Letty sacrifices herself, and makes his death untrue. And he remembers like both, kind of, not, right? Like he remembers her sacrificing himself, or herself, pronouns. He remembers the sacrifice and feels like because of the sacrifice that she died in his place. But in reality, he also died. Do you know what I'm trying to say? I hope you get what I'm trying to say. And we're then told that the Hungerbirds did in fact tear out his heart, that he screamed so piteously as he died that Letty couldn't abide it. She had to do something, and so she gave her life. So I have a couple of questions about this, and again, no answers. I would love your input on the ending of this book. So if we go back to the maiden mother crone, the Letty is the maiden. She's the one who represents the future. She is what will be. And she gives her life. But Ginny, Mrs. Hempstock, is the mother. She is, by definition, the life giver, the person who exists in the present. And I'm curious if Ginny chose to let the boy die and was like, all right, I'm a god. I'm a goddess. I don't need any of this shit. Mortals die. And then the mistake in her not giving life to the boy is that her daughter Letty dies. The youthful aspect of this triunity, this 3-in-1 goddess, dies, leaving the Mother Maiden Crone triad incomplete. And then Mrs. Hempstock, Ginny Hempstock, doesn't feel confident. Like, I get the feeling that the crone, old Mrs. Hempstock, feels confident that one day Letty will come back, that one day Letty will be healed and come back. Ginny doesn't seem so sure. And I just find it odd that the giver of life can't deal with Letty in some way, can't bring Letty back in some way, that the ocean of all knowledge, the ocean of the universe or whatever, is where Letty has to go heal. And I'm not sure if that's just like pushing things beyond, like, are we just borrowing these archetypes, and in pushing it further, am I finding holes? Can I not push them that far? Like, is the push to the logical conclusion of the archetype just not where I'm meant to go? I'm curious how folks felt about that, if folks were satisfied with this sort of non-reaction of Mrs. Hempstock and old Mrs. Hempstock. And then my other question is, like, the heart of the narrator. The birds ate the heart of the narrator and he died. Is it a literal heart? Is it a metaphorical heart? Is it like when they say heart, is it more his soul, his essence, what makes him human that they ate? And the reason I ask this is because there's a line at the end about how the Hempstocks see that the adult narrator now is doing better. The last time we saw you, you weren't doing very good. You're growing a new heart for start. And that was on page 168. So is it like the metaphorical heart? He was brokenhearted, and now that's slowly repairing throughout his life. This like trauma, this emotional damage is repairing. And the reason I ask that is because with this whole like heart thing, I'm reminded of The Grinch Who Stole Christmas. And so the Grinch is up on Mount Crumpet, and he has the sleigh full of Christmas crap. And he realizes that the meaning of Christmas is joy. And he decides to sacrifice himself, put himself in danger, to bring that joy to others. And when he makes that decision, the Grinch's small heart grew 3 sizes that day, right? The idea that his heart heals with this sacrifice. And the boy, in this moment, has just sacrificed his life for his world. He sees the hunger birds eating his world, and he makes this very thoughtful, soulful decision, this sacrifice that the Hempstocks then take away from him, right? Because he remembers that both and, right? That he's dead, he's not dead. He makes the sacrifice, he doesn't make the sacrifice. Do they deprive him of this personal development? Lydia is saying in the chat that they didn't mind the ending. It got a bit muddled and weird for sure, but it felt very much like Ginny was always a little unforgiving about Letty's death. Yes, I feel like Mrs. Hempstock, Ginny Hempstock, is harsh. She is harsh with the boy. That car ride back to his house, she's like, no, like, Letty died for you. Like, you better go fucking live a good life. Like, you can't hide out on our farm. You go live. She made this big choice. And like, I feel like that's such a big burden to put on a kid, right? That your life has to be worth something because of Letty's sacrifice. Which kind of brings me to my last question. Why did the narrator have to forget? Why did they take that memory away? And why do they keep taking it away? I feel like it's an odd choice for a story, right? Most stories, especially ones with child protagonists, they're about character development. And so in the memory, we watch a narrative arc happen. The boy learns, and then he makes a big sacrifice. And the adult sort of relearns that in having his memory come back to him. And so he sort of experiences this character development as well. By the end of the story, he's by the pond and he's like, oh my gosh, I remember this. I remember this now. And in that moment has an opportunity to reframe himself, right? He has an opportunity to think about what has been given for him to live this life, the choices that he's making, how he's living as an artist, as a person. And then they take it away from him. And if they keep taking away that, you would think it's a super pivotal memory, just like learning the truth that his father drowned him. There's a moment where the boy, they've snipped out that memory from the father's memory, and the boy asks, if I burn this scrap of fabric that like represents the memory, will I forget? And they ask him if he wants to forget, and he says, no, I want to remember because it happened to me and I'm still me. He expresses this desire to hold on to this traumatic memory because it shapes him. So like he's expressed this value, and then the Hempstock women just take it away. They snip this opportunity away. And it's sort of, we watch the character development happen. We know that the adult remembers it happening, and doors are open to him again to shift who he is as a human with this new knowledge. And then they cut it short, and he forgets everything and goes back to, oh, I have to go to a funeral. I have to go to this social obligation after the funeral, and like it's gone. And I don't know, I find that ending really unsettling. It feels like a violation. It undoes everything. Like, even though his heart may be healing, he may be growing back his heart, it feels like they've taken something really vital from him, and he has learned and then unlearned things. And it makes me feel less kindly towards the Hempstock women. Like, I really like that they are these powerful women living off the land, that they're sort of meddling on the periphery, I assume. They clean up fleas that come into the world. But this feels like such a huge violation. I don't know. How did folks feel about the ending? Did you like it? Did it feel satisfying? Did it feel hopeful? Like, the one thing that I'm holding on to is that line about his heart regrowing. And that he seems to be doing that on his own, despite the fact that he's had this important thing taken away from him. It's also fine. It's a lot of stuff that I'm also dropping on folks. So just something to keep in mind if you are thinking about this text. Like, what do we take away from this? Like, what can we take away? Personally, I'm taking away a lot about the idea of maintaining some sort of childish wonder, some sort of childish unstructure. Do you know what I mean? Like so much of adult life feels very prescribed, very structured. And I think something to take away from this is that there is value in allowing for some of that freedom, some of that possibility, that play, and also that nobody feels like an adult, which is great. I love that. Also, keeping in mind time, I think I'm going to sort of wrap it up here. So do let me know any thoughts in the comments, in the chat there. I really, overall, I enjoyed this book. I enjoyed pulling it apart. I feel like it's definitely one that I will keep in my collection, that I will reread. And I feel like also now I want to read the Sandman comics to see this, I guess, other iteration of the hemp stalks. Like here we have this homestead living off the land. They almost feel like round and cute hemp stalks, mother maiden crone. Based on what I remember of Sandman, I've read the first volume. That is a very dark series. So I'm curious to see these archetypes played with in another way. So yeah, overall, I enjoyed it. I thought it was a fun pick. And as sort of a wrap up to this, you all get a sneak peek of what I'll be announcing later, probably next week, which is the next book club book. So voting patrons submitted the books and then they voted on them. And so the one that won is A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. And so this is based on 2 lectures that Woolf delivered. And she uses extended metaphors throughout it. So my sort of, I haven't read this, but my sense of this text is that it's sort of more narrative, a little bit accessible, more accessible, early feminist thinking. And I think it will be an interesting read. I think it will also be not without criticism, because Virginia Woolf is a white woman doing white woman's feminist thinking. And so I'm excited to sort of read this foundational text and then have us think critically about how it lands in 2022. So this is a text that I hope will be easy for folks to find. I know it's in public domain in Canada. I'm not sure if it's in public domain in all countries, but it is definitely worth taking a look to see if you can find a free ebook version. If not, I ended up finding my copy used in a used bookstore near universities and colleges. It's on a lot of courses because it is sort of this foundational text. So hopefully it'll be easy to find a used copy, a cheap copy, a free copy. Libraries probably have it. So I'm happy that it's an easy book to find. So I'm excited. I'm very excited. I'm excited to not read it in isolation, because some of these texts that we've read as a book club are definitely things that you want to pick apart and see what other folks think. So I'm going to jump back to the chat here for a second before we go. Lydia liked it. I agree. It packed a punch. And I have so much to think about now. I've really enjoyed this experience of reading it and doing a little bit of research for it. So I'm so glad we picked this as our first book club book. So mindful of everyone's time, I'm also going to wrap things up here. I look forward to chatting with folks at the end of April. So we are aiming for the last February in April, which I believe is the 30th, Saturday, April 30th. I will confirm the date for sure. So I hope that folks are interested in reading along. Thank you so much for chatting here. It was fun to just get different perspectives on this. So thank you. I hope that you all are doing well, that you're staying safe, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye.